Casie Menhinick. I'm a realtor with eXp Realty, and we're having a conversation about invasive species and how it can impact real estate, whether it's for real estate agents' knowledge or just anybody in general that's owning land, buying or selling. I think this is going to be great information for what people need to look for when they're purchasing real estate, or even just being aware of as we're traveling around. I know my own learning curve, the more I dive into sort of the impacts that invasive species can have, whether it's soil contaminants or weeds or wildlife issues. I follow along with the Lillooet Regional Invasive Species site, and like just little things like baby's breath from weddings, and like how many times we see that out on the grasslands in Kamloops on the hiking trails and stuff, and forget how quickly it can take over. So I'm excited to hear all the info that you guys have to share today. I think, Jackie, you said you've got the slideshow, so you're going to put that up and we will listen.
Great. Thanks so much, Casie. I'm excited and thankful to be here. So I am going to share my screen. Here we go. So I just grabbed this screenshot from Casie's amazing site so that we can introduce the topic this morning and actually this afternoon. So my name is Jacquie Rasmussen. I'm with the Invasive Species Society from Lillooet. I'm the coordinator here. I'm based out of Lillooet, and I work, live, and play on the traditional and unceded territory of the St'át'imc. I'm here with my colleague, Coleen Hougen, to share some information about invasive species. And we would like to share this with you as professionals working and seeing people's properties. So I've lived in Lillooet for 25 years, and I've worked with Elris for 11. And so a big shout out again to Casie, who's invited us to speak with you today. She is very familiar with invasive plants. She has a long history of managing invasives in the Bridge River Valley when she operated a family guide outfitting operation, as well as on her own property when growing food and caring for horses. So thanks, Casie, for inviting me and Coleen to talk to everyone today. So I'll turn it over to Coleen to introduce herself.
Yeah, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Coleen Hougen, and I'm the Invasive Plant Management Coordinator for the Thompson Nicola Invasive Plant Management Committee, as well as the Thompson Nicola Regional District. I've lived in Kamloops since 2006, where I have raised my family and enjoy all of the backcountry where we do our camping and fishing. And I just wanted to acknowledge that Kamloops is located on the unceded Secwepemc territory. Thanks, Jackie, and thanks for having me.
And thank you both for being here.
So we're going to skip some Zoom reminders because I think mostly we're going to have a recording of this so that to share with everybody. So just sit back and relax and enjoy the presentation. If you should have any questions later, we'll be able to connect with you, and we have our personal contact information.
Perfect.
All right. So the first thing that we want to just go over is just to frame and give perspective about this. Invasive species impact property values, and they do it in a number of ways. And one of the main reasons we're here talking to you is to help your clients minimize the impacts of invasive species to their properties. And just one example here of a story from the UK in 2011, where a couple was told that they had to demolish their home because of an invasive plant called Japanese knotweed. We do have this in BC, and we also have it in the Lillooet region. The plant was growing through the floorboards and the walls. So the value of their home went from £305,000 to $50,000. So that's about equivalent to current day Canadian dollars of $484,000 to $79,000. So it was an 84% drop in their property values. So just to give you some pictures of what that looked like, here's the homeowner with the Japanese knotweed coming through the side of the home. And then here's a picture of Japanese knotweed actually growing through the floorboards. It's pretty shocking. So why should we be concerned? It's really important to understand the impacts and to be able to explain that to your clients. And there's a number of them. So invasive species create harm to humans, the environment, and the economy. As someone who is either assisting people to sell their homes or purchase a new one, invasive species and these impacts should be considered. So like I've explained before, infrastructure like house foundations, sidewalks, and driveways can be impacted by invasives. Knotweed can crack pavement as shown in this picture, and many invasive tree roots can lift sidewalks and damage water and sewage pipes. So some properties in the UK can't actually get home insurance if they have knotweed on their property because of the damage it causes. The other one down on the lower left, you can see is a picture of actually my house where my husband and my very old picture of my son, he's quite grown by now, is lighting, doing some spring burning. And just an example of invasive plants create large, dense patches of fuel and dry grass and dry plant matter. When the plants dry out and it becomes a potential fire hazard. So these patches can cause fires and they can cause them to spread easily that's close to your home. So the other thing that is a problem is environmental degradation, impacts to stream banks, soil erosion, and reduced desirability for forage for livestock and overall biodiversity on your property. The other picture there in the lower right-hand side is a horse with his or her mane full of burdock burrs. So there's harm to livestock and pets. Invasive plants with burrs can be hazardous to your pets and livestock. If you have a client that is looking for property with acreage for horses or other livestock, it's important to know what invasive plants are on that property that could harm them. Invasives also impact the quality and amount of forage plants for livestock grazing. The picture at the top right is a little boy who has been harmed and burned by a toxic sap that's in something called donkey tail or myrtle spurge. Mm. So it's a common garden plant in Lillooet, and I know that it's quite frequent across our regions. And when they were pulling this plant up, this little person brushed their face, and the sap caused these blisters and burns. So these are just some of the main reasons why it's really important to talk to your clients and to know what you're seeing on properties to be able to identify them.
I think that, sorry to interrupt, for real estate agents, we're educated about the environmental hazards that could impact property values when it comes to non-conforming septics and riparian issues or buried oil tanks. And we have special disclosure statements for that. And often we'll do additional inspections or remediation prior to a purchase because we know, same as you mentioned with the UK case, how much property values can depreciate if there's an issue or the out-of-pocket cost to that homeowner. But very few of us know the impacts that these invasive species can cause, not just like you mentioned to our property value, but our neighboring properties as well. So when we start seeing more lawsuits, it brings to the attention for real estate agents in particular, just because that's my field, about the importance of keeping your eyes wide open and looking at foundation and driveway issues for other reasons than just structural integrity, but how that might be impacted if you've got the weeds growing up the side of the house, and that further investigation. I guess, do you guys sometimes do consultations as agrologists for site visits for invasive species for identification or anything? If somebody wanted to contract you, how would that work?
We can definitely arrange that. The Lillooet Invasive Species Society has some limited capacity to do that, but also too, as an agrologist in that field, I have done some limited site visits, but mostly with my work with LRIS. So we can be contacted on the side. I'll let Coleen speak to that as well.
Yeah, within the Thompson Nicola Regional District, we have invasive plant program services, and one of those are private land consultations. Okay. So there's only certain people that are eligible. It's regional district residents, as well as 5 member municipalities have signed on as well as of last year, and that's Clearwater, Sun Peaks, Merritt, Logan Lake, and Clinton, I think. Clinton or Cache Creek, I can't quite remember, but
probably Clinton,
yeah. So those residents are eligible for the private land consults, so they can connect with us, and we put them in touch with Purity Feed out of Kamloops, and then they have an agrologist that comes out to do the site inspection. But outside of those areas, you would have to rely on getting an agrologist. And I would say I'm available, but my time in the summer months is limited.
I'm starting to see some bylaws come into play, like, so Lillooet, where Jacquie is the SLRD side. And so I work more in the TNRD than I do the SLRD. Lillooet's kind of my only pocket community that falls within the Squamish Lillooet Regional District, well, and up through to Goldbridge. And so I have noticed that they're starting, and they probably have all along, there's just more awareness as to the bylaws and enforcement issues if you are found moving soil off site or selling it without proper permits because of contamination issues. So it'll be interesting as knowledge progresses, the more informed people get. And overall, I guess it's an enforcement issue to have enough staff or resources to pull from to help with the real estate transactions for consultations. Or
definitely, it's right now it's more of a capacity issue, being able to connect with individual homeowners. And it's great that the TNRD has that program with the Squamish Lillooet Regional District. It's something that we could consider setting up, and we do have a service bylaw for invasive species. So at this point, it's mostly outreach and education that we focus on, like this presentation. But we've done quite a few, helping homeowners to understand at least what they've got on their property. Once, especially with new homeowners, I find that recently people coming into Lillooet, they're reaching out to us and saying, like, I just bought this piece of property and now everything's coming up in the spring and I'm not too sure what it is. So we're helping people to identify what those things are and being able to give them advice on how to manage what they've got. So and the District of Lillooet is contemplating potentially, I think, a new bylaw, but definitely the Squamish Lillooet Regional District has a bylaw that relates to our specific priority list. And we're going to get into that a little bit later in our presentation, and we'll describe that in a little bit more detail.
Perfect.
Yeah.
All right. Okay. Well, then we'll move on here. Some of you probably don't even know what invasive species are. So what are they? So they're usually defined as any non-native plant or animal species that has the capacity to negatively impact our economy, animals, humans, and the environment. They're generally free of natural predators that keep them in check in their native habitats. So without those predators over here, they have a competitive edge over desirable or native vegetation. And they typically establish, spread, and take over our native areas very quickly. So in terms of invasive plants, they do have special characteristics that allow them to move to new areas, establish and flourish rapidly. And some of these features include the ability to grow fast. So many of them establish and complete their life cycle within 1 to 2 years. They produce a lot of seeds. So for example, a single oxeye daisy plant, as seen as on the photo there, can produce up to 500 seeds that remain viable for 3 or more years in the soil. So some of them can reproduce vegetatively through root and shoot fragments, and some can do both, so vegetatively and through seed production. So they're also highly effective seed dispersers and have physical characteristics that enable them to easily hitch a ride to new locations. And they're really able to withstand poor habitat conditions and easily take advantage of disturbed areas. So, for example, you can see the wood sage shown on the bottom right photo. It was likely dumped as a garden waste on the side of the road where it's established under poor conditions and has now spread into a large field that is used to grow hay. And because they've been introduced to BC, like we mentioned, they don't have those predators or diseases that would naturally keep their populations in check. So where do they come from? Invasive plants can spread in a variety of ways. When we talk about pathways of invasion and vectors of spread, we're talking about the routes that invasive plants typically travel and the mechanisms that move them. So there's 2 general ways that invasives are introduced, and that's intentionally or unintentionally. So intentional pathways of introduction include things like importing exotic species for pets or their use of invasive plants in horticultural activities. And horticulture, including gardening activities, is one of the key pathways of invasive plant introductions and spread. in BC. So there currently isn't legislation banning the sale or trade of invasive plants in BC, and many plant nurseries and garden centers both knowingly and unknowingly continue to sell invasive plants and seeds. And the vector of spread isn't limited to nurseries. Gardeners also knowingly and unknowingly purchase and plant these plants in their gardens and often take cuttings or divide a plant to share with someone they know, like their neighbor. Unintentional invasive plant establishment includes sharing equipment. So if you're sharing your lawnmowers with your neighbor that have plant parts with contaminated soil on them, that's one way to move invasive plants between yards and properties. The same goes for larger work projects that use excavators or tractors that are contaminated with invasives. Buying seed mixes, especially those pesky wildflower mixes, they often have invasive species in them, but they're typically not listed on the back of the package. Sometimes they are, sometimes they aren't. So a general rule of thumb is to avoid planting those wildflower seed mixes.
I think bachelor buttons are invasive, aren't they?
Yes.
Yeah.
Quite often, bachelor's button and baby's breath are in those seed mixes. Yeah. So, and the last piece here is moving soil and adding soil can also move invasives and cause them to establish. So this is also true for manure that people get for their gardens, and that manure is not pure. It often contains invasive plant seeds. So some examples of pathways of invasive plant spread include shipping. So international shipping is one of the primary ways that non-native species, including invasive plants, spread throughout the world. Species hitchhike on trade goods, aboard shipping containers, on agricultural commodities, in the ballast water of ship, and in wood packaging materials. And a fun fact for you all is that Vancouver is the 45th largest container port in the world. In 2018, Vancouver ports received over 3.2 million containers, and who really knows how many and what invasive species were hiding in those containers.
It's interesting because I'm in Ashcroft, is where my home is now, and we have the largest inland port terminal in Canada. So where the containers come off the trains and get shipped to other locations by truck. So same thing, that the trend just keeps continuing as to what's hitchhiking on all these containers too.
Yeah, that's right. Through rail or water, they hide, and there are inspections done, but nothing is really quarantined per se to get rid of all of the invasive species that might be hiding in them. So the next one is trade. It's also a pathway of introduction. And one of the primary pathways is through the horticultural trade and the selling, purchasing, and trading of plant species across the globe. We see this locally as well in garden practices, with nurseries selling invasive plants, gardeners purchasing and trading invasive plants, and people using contaminated wildflower seed mixes, as we've already mentioned. And again, these little packets are often a culprit for invasive plant introduction, and many contain invasive species such as common tansy, and we mentioned bachelor's button, and many more. So our public service announcement here is to know what you grow, read the back of the package, and if you're hesitant at all, just choose not to plant out of seed packages. Know what you're planting. Industry and urban development can result in invasive plant spread through the movement of contaminated materials such as soil and aggregates, disturbance of soil and contaminated machinery, wildlife, livestock, and pets, as Jacquie showed with the horse with the burdock in its mane. Also unknowingly spread invasive plants by seed, clinging to their fur, or seeds being passed through their digestive system. So birds are a culprit as well, where they like to eat those berries and then they release them kilometers away from where they pick them up. And finally, humans. So sadly, you and I are vectors of spread. We inadvertently spread weeds in our day-to-day recreational activities, such as off-roading, hiking, biking, and even snowshoeing in the winter. So through these activities, plant parts and mud containing seeds get transported on our tires, boots, snowshoes, and other recreational gear.
Thanks, Coleen. And I just wanted to mention that the Lillooet Timber Mart and Garden and Feed Center actually has committed to not selling any invasive plants at all. So they take the list of over 200 species that the government provides with them when they're buying and purchasing, and they make sure that they're not purchasing anything that is going to be sold in their store that's invasive. So I really wanted to put a shout out to them because they're very interactive with me, and anything they get new, and they invite me to look at their plant stock just to make sure when they bring spring inventory in.
That's wonderful. I think same for real estate agents, like on the educational standpoint, when we're viewing properties with our clients, if we could provide resources and handouts to help them know that if they move forward with a purchase, how they're going to properly manage maybe the burdock that's on there or knapweed that's growing up the side of the road. The more awareness we have and the more people we have helping to control it, I'm sure will be a huge advantage to everyone in all fields, right?
Absolutely, Casie. That's a really good point, and something that we should talk about offline. We do, between Coleen and I, have lots of resources that we can point your way, and you'll be able to provide it. And many of them are digital, so it's really easy to provide that to your clients.
I have a couple that I use, but again, just like you said, and a few, like I can see some pictures from around Lillooet, like even as a real estate agent, if I'm venturing out on agricultural pieces of property with clients, we're often seeing maybe 2, 3, 4 different acreages in a day. And I know last summer I was walking on one and I had a longer sweater on. And by the time I got back to the car, the entire back side of it was covered in burdock. But we were going to 2 more acreages still. So we had to do like a full cleaning from head to toe before we could move on to the next property. Because again, we were just a trail of weeds that was about to happen. And if you don't know, then obviously you've become the problem.
Yeah, definitely. This has happened to many of us, and definitely a good point to be able to even just take a picture and put it on your social media. It's a great learning opportunity as well.
An uncomfortable day.
Yeah, definitely. So I just wanted to move on to what can real estate agents actually do? We've been talking about it throughout the presentation, and it's really good to get that feedback as we're going with Casie. So one of the main things is that you can provide a wealth of knowledge and pass that along. And we're going to definitely be able to give more resources and be, because that's sort of our job, to be able to be up to date on the most recent and the best management techniques. And so we'll be able to give those to you guys, and then be able to get them out to your clients. And we just wanted to explain some simple things that you can do that don't take a lot of time and that have a really good return for the time that you've spent. So they include things like learn to identify invasive plants and species, research the property history just to find out what's been going on, complete a property assessment, know legislation and local bylaws, and help your clients to navigate disclosure statements with regards to invasive species. So as an addition to this presentation, you could also take the ISC BC, which is the Invasive Species Council of BC Real Estate and Land Use course that is online. It's a free course and addresses invasive species from a provincial perspective. And so that we'll provide that link to you guys for the information afterwards, and something that Casie can put into the chat or into the actual a social media channel that this will go on to. So we're going to go into each of these things separately, and we'll move on from here. So the first thing is learning to identify invasive plants. Both Coleen and I have priority species and lists, because there are a lot of invasive species, but there are key ones that you should be looking out for that are high priority in each of our regions. You don't have to be an expert, and there are a few key tools that make you look like an invasive species guru. There are 2 apps that you can download on your phone. One is iNaturalist, and the other is called the Invasive Alien Species app. So the Invasive Alien Species app is a reporting tool, and it also has photographs of invasive species common to BC. So just a note about reporting: confirmation of a species from this app sometimes takes a while. So if you're not sure about your identification, It's always very good to take a picture and or possibly a sample if there's a lot of the plants there, and contact a regional invasive species organization directly. So either, Coleen or I, you'll get a faster turnaround. The other thing with something like iNaturalist or PlantNet, PlantSnap, and something like Seek, which is the younger version of iNaturalist, those things can give you suggestions about what the plant ID is. And then if you really don't feel very confident about what they're telling you, just come back to us and we'll help you figure out what it is. If you have an iPhone, if you actually look up the information, you hit the little icon down below here that says sometimes it will allow you to look up that plant. So there's an identification. It will give you suggestions based on accessing the internet. So that's another resource that you have. There's the I. So the second is understanding property history. Casie made mention of this before, that basically it's like looking at the entire property. It's the first step to help your client research. And has the owner noticed any plants taking over parts of the yard or ants biting their dog? What about the neighboring properties? Do they have any issues with invasive species that have been reported, say, to the local bylaw officer? Or have the neighbors discuss things? So be creative and be curious. You're not trying to catch people, with bad invasives and reporting them. The goal is to have the best information to either address the invasives before the sale or to make sure the client that's purchasing the land and the property understands the potential impacts and the removal costs of an existing infestation. So, if somebody really wants to have a piece of property they're going to have for their horse, they really need to know if that property has some forage or the capability. If it's covered in an invasive plant, they need to know how much it's going to cost to remove that invasive.
Yeah, so really it comes down to realtors and their clients carrying out a full review of the property. And this includes surveying yards, pastures, fence lines on both sides, and road right-of-ways for monocultures or patches of plants that look like they could be acting invasive. Also, like Jacquie said, inspect the house and yard for any signs of insects, inspect all concrete surfaces like patios, sidewalks, and driveways for any signs of cracks and heaving. And be aware that it'll be harder to identify and likely even see invasive plants in the winter. It'll take a bit more investigating to know if you're dealing with any invasive plants on the property at that point in time. So during the assessment, if you suspect that there's a plant, a tree, or an insect that's invasive, but not sure, as Jacquie mentioned, the easiest thing for you and for us is to just snap a photo and contact your local regional invasive species organization for help with the identification, the potential impacts, and some treatment options. So we're going to move on to this topic, which is kind of a big one, but we're going to try and keep it simple, which is legislation and bylaws. So we've included this slide to make you aware that there is legislation governing the management of invasive plants on private and municipal lands, and landowners do have a legal responsibility to control invasive plants and noxious weeds on their property. And some of the examples of applicable legislation include the BC Weed Control Act. So this act states that landowners and occupiers have a duty to control noxious weeds at provincial and regional levels. And this act includes a list of regulated species, albeit it's very, very old. Through this act, it can be required for the seller of the property to control the noxious weeds on their property prior to sale. Also, there are regional bylaws. So the Squamish Lillooet Regional District and the Thompson Nicola Regional District have bylaws for invasive plants. They require owners or occupiers of real property to ensure that their property is cleared of all and remains free of regional priority invasive plants. The bylaws are typically enacted when there's a formal complaint, and part of Jacquie and I's role is to work with the regional districts and support with inspection and discussion with landowners where there is a bylaw infraction. So regional districts and some municipalities have soil deposition and removal bylaws where a permit is needed to move soil. So there are these bylaws within the SLRD and the city of Kamloops. Moving soil can cause the establishment of invasives, and local governments can also regulate the safe disposal of invasive species.
Can I ask just a quick question? So are you finding that the landscapers who are bringing soil onto different sites when people are doing, say, new builds, are they getting permits for transporting soil, or is that governed by sort of the wholesaler or whoever's supplying the topsoil for different sites? Do you know how that works? Like, I know of a contamination issue that was way up on the Sunshine Coast. A beautiful luxury home brought in new soil for all of their gardens, and it had some sort of beetle in it that ate out all of the roots of, thousands and thousands of dollars worth of plants. And so there was a huge financial loss that way. I'm wondering, obviously that could skip from property to property as well. I'm wondering how that actually gets regulated. Would that landscaper be liable for that? They probably didn't have a permit. Most probably don't.
Yeah. Jacquie, do you want to speak to that, or do you want me to take a stab at it?
You can take a stab at it and I'll fill in.
Yeah. Well, the TNRD doesn't have those permits, so I'm not really sure how they're regulated, but from what I know about regulations, the enforcement piece is often lacking. Yeah. So I think it's due diligence on both the supplier and the retailer to do some due diligence in asking those questions, like, are there invasive plants in these soils and that sort of thing. I can't speak on behalf of the city of Kamloops on how they enforce it. And I don't know, Jacquie, if you know how the SLRD enforces that.
I believe I know that the soil movement bylaw is triggered by the amount of soil that gets moved. And it really is the due diligence of the company that is moving the soil. So it would be more the landscaper. That's my limited knowledge. You'd have to actually ask the bylaw officer a little bit more on that, Casie, but my understanding is it's the landscaper that would be responsible for that and asking those questions. The supplier of the soil, obviously wouldn't need a permit. And right now we don't have my understanding is we don't have any BC regulation about what's in soils and what gets moved around. That's why the bylaws have been enacted. They're trying to at least, trigger and regulate the movement of soil. So that's kind of where we're at right now.
It's kind of two varying degrees. So like if somebody had a large piece of agricultural property that had great soil and they were going to be taking several dump truck loads and selling it as income, that would be very different than just a landscaper bringing over one load for the new bedding plants that were being surfaced. But again, it's education on the homeowner's part of asking where it's coming from, if it's been tested, and what else might be coming up with the soil come good weather.
Yeah, I always use the example of in Chilliwack, the movement of soil from there up to our region, which has occurred in the past down in Chilliwack. That's the closest place we have fire ants, and we're going to talk a little bit about fire ants, but it's the only way that they can move because the queens don't actually fly. So you really need to ask a lot of questions about where your soil is coming from and what invasive species could be hiding in that soil. Cool.
All right. Okay. Well, there's just one more piece of legislation to consider, which are covenants. And a covenant may include provisions that restrict the use of or require that improvements be made on the property for the protection of natural, environmental, and wildlife values. So if invasive species causes damage or issues related to the provisions, the landowner could be found legally responsible. There is a whole other suite of federal and provincial legislation. I'm not going to go into them in detail, but I'll just kind of list a few. And if you have interest in seeking those out, you can. So the first is the Federal Seeds Act. There's the Federal Plant Protection Act, the Forest and Range Practices Act and Regulations, the BC Community Charter, Local Government Act, the Wildlife Act, particularly the Controlled Alien Species Regulation, and the Integrated Pest Management Act. So as you guys are aware, disclosure statements are effective tools to communicate to buyers and sellers about invasive species on the property. I'd like to provide an example of where including invasive plants on a disclosure statement could have saved the new homeowners thousands of dollars. So there were some homeowners in Clearwater that purchased some property infested with knotweed. The sale took place and it was not disclosed on the property that it had knotweed on it. So we saw knotweed earlier in the presentation, and they're known for their very expansive root system that can kind of spread throughout the property and have adverse impacts on infrastructure. So shortly after the purchase, the new owners realized that the knotweed roots had penetrated their septic system and they had to replace it, costing them thousands of dollars, placing a significant financial burden on them. If this was disclosed on the house sale, perhaps a negotiation could have been made with the sale to ensure there was funds available for the treatment of the invasive plant and or a septic inspection. So in doing your due diligence as realtors, we recommend that you inspect the property with the seller for invasive plants. Encourage your clients to manage and control invasive plants on their property prior to listing. The seller should also be advised to disclose known invasive species on the property disclosure statement, and this will avoid any future control costs that could come back to the seller if not listed. Failure to carry out these actions could result in the invasive species being considered a latent material defect similar to mold, as some invasive plants are toxic and can impact infrastructure integrity.
And just before we move on from this topic, the one thing that we'd like to make sure that you relay to the clients as far as if there's anything to do with management and control of invasives is that you really look into the knowledge and expertise of the person that you would come in, like at the professional that you would bring in to do that. And one thing that is really important is if there is going to be any herbicides used for the treatment of the invasive species, if it's beyond, removing by manual means like digging or excavating, that they need to have a BC provincial certification, which is called a pesticide applicator certificate. So that is a really key piece of certification so that you have confidence that this person has taken it's a 3-day at least a 3-day course, and there's a fairly extensive test that is required for the certification process. So next, we're going to go into some key species to be aware of. We've split it into urban and kind of rural species, and these are species that we have in both our regions, and we just wanted to highlight some of them. So this is knotweed. It's found on private property in Lillooet, and it's very hard to establish at first, but then it becomes even harder to eradicate. As explained before, Coleen mentioned its extensive root system, and when it's planted, it grows very quickly. So this is the attractiveness of this plant, is that it grows like inches in weeks. And what happens is it will create a nice shady screen. And then in the wintertime, it basically dies back to nothing. It was introduced from Asia as an ornamental bamboo. It reproduces through long creeping rhizomes and is capable of establishing a new plant, even with a tiny, small stem fragment. And you can see in the picture with the leaves that they are in a zigzag pattern along the stem. Basically, this plant was originally from Japan, and it would grow after new lava would come down the volcano sides. So it's really a very hardy plant. The next plant that we want to highlight is something called Tree of Heaven. Originally from China, it reproduces by seeds, roots, and suckers, and looks very, very similar to sumac. The leaves have a very foul smell, like burnt rubber or peanut butter, but it doesn't, not necessarily all the time. So sometimes you have to identify it through other means. Once you have it, it's very hard to get rid of because it responds to cutting by suckering. So there's a lot of people over in Lillooet that tried to just cut them down, and then they just continued to get small suckers and made hedges of these trees and shrubs. It's a preferred host to the spotted lanternfly, this insect right here. And it's very problematic. The spotted lanternfly is an insect originally from Asia, and it kills plants by sucking on the sap from the leaves and stems. And it feeds in swarms on more than 70 species of trees and plants, including cultivated grapes, fruit trees, black walnut, maples, and oaks. So this little we don't have spotted lanternfly yet, but we've been told by our professionals and agrologists working out of the Summerland Research Ministry of Agriculture that it's not a matter of when or if, it's when it will come. This picture above is a stump of a tree of heaven in Ashcroft, and you can see how the roots have lifted up the blacktop, and you can see how that this tree has the potential to damage walkways, driveways, and other infrastructure. So the next plants are spurges. And on this, the left-hand side, this is called cypress spurge, and it's a perennial that spreads by creeping rhizomes. It grows 15 to 30 centimeters tall and has a yellow to pinkish flower. These spurges are very popular in gardens. It has a sap that is mildly toxic to cattle and horses and can cause rashes on humans. The seeds can last in the soil for up to 8 years, and it's often planted in gardens because it doesn't need much water. So in the Elrus region, we found it has spread from abandoned properties onto roadways. The next plant, the cousin of cypress spurge, is myrtle spurge, and it is also known as donkey tail spurge. It's perennial succulent that has yellow flowers. It grows up to 15 centimeters in height, and it spreads primarily by seeds. And it can also spread by roots. What's interesting about this plant is the seed pods actually burst in the heat of summer, so it can project the seeds up to 5 meters away. It spreads very easily and takes over garden areas and will spread from disturbed areas and into disturbed areas and ditches, as shown in this photo. So the donkey tail spurge is what I talked about earlier. It has that toxic sap that can cause blisters in the child picture, and both spurges are very common. So you'll see them everywhere once you now know what they are. Hoary cress I'm just switching now to rural plants in rural environments. And this is a picture of hoary cress. You can see the white top. It's also called white top. It's a creeping rooted perennial in the mustard family, and it grows up to 60 centimeters tall. It has a cluster of white flowers on the top, and it can often contaminate hay crops. It's definitely unpalatable to livestock. So this is one of those species that impacts agriculture property. This is an infestation of hoary cress adjacent to an alfalfa field and a winter livestock feeding area near Lillooet. Hoary cress can take over large areas and outcompete other species. So when representing clients that are either buying or selling property for agriculture production, it's even more important to understand what invasive species are on the property. The buyers are at most risk because they could have to incur the cost of multiple years of treatment or the cost of not being able to use that portion of the land for their business.
Hey, the next plant is blue weed. So that is on the left-hand side there on the screen. It's a biennial to short-lived perennial with bright blue blossoms. It has stiff short hairs on the stem and can grow up to 80 centimeters tall. It can produce up to 2,800 seeds per plant that remain viable for several years. And it has taken over some of the areas in Merritt. So particularly if any of you have gone through Lower Nicola during the summer months, you will essentially see a sea of blue along the roadsides and in pastures. And it just really takes over that native vegetation and forage in the pasture areas, degrading the land values. The next plant is common tansy on the right. It's a yellow button flower with no petals. It spreads by seed and roots. It has deeply divided leaves that are very fern-like, and it flowers July to September and grows up to 1.5 meters tall. This plant contains toxic compounds that are toxic to humans and grazers, so it's unpalatable to most livestock and degrades fields and forage availability. But it is also a plant that is commonly found in gardens. So it's one that can hide in the seed mixes, and people inadvertently and advertently plant it in their garden. The next plant is Hoary alyssum. So it's an annual to short-lived perennial. It has a long flowering time from May to October, and it spreads by seed. It grows between 30 centimeters to a meter tall, and it has small clusters of white flowers at the top of the stems. So this plant is of concern because it's toxic to horses. It can cause fever, lymphedema, and laminitis, which is inflammation of the inside hoof. Horses tend to avoid eating the living plant if there's preferable forage available. However, they will inadvertently eat it in hay. So the photo I have on the screen there of the pasture was taken in Chase. And that field on the left-hand side was bound into hay bales and actually sold to somebody in the Lower Mainland. Fortunately enough, the person in the Lower Mainland recognized the Hoary alyssum and knew the impacts, so they refused the bales, essentially told the provider to burn them, and then that cost the landowner lost income. So the next plant is sulfur cinquefoil. It's a perennial plant in the rose family. The leaves have 5 lobes in a palmate shape. It has light yellow flowers with 5 petals. It is from 30 to 70 centimeters tall. But the tricky part with this plant is that there are 27 potentilla species in BC, so it can be hard to identify. It spreads by roots and seeds and flowers in June and July. It can contaminate hay and livestock bedding material, and it's unpalatable to grazing animals. So it, again, reduces forage value in cultivated fields and rangelands. So this is a picture. This is actually a bylaw incident last year. It's a photo of a property near Pritchard. And what you're seeing, all of the yellow there is sulfur cinquefoil in that pasture. So what we're seeing is folks from the Lower Mainland moving into the interior, trying to live the small hobby farm ranch dream. And quite often they're uneducated. They're looking to purchase real property and support grazing animals, and they don't know what to look for. And in this case, if someone were to buy this property, it has 0 forage quality for their livestock. And the last invasive plant we wanted to highlight was spotted knapweed. So it's one of several knapweed species in BC that are invasive. It can grow over 1.5 meters tall. The flowers are a single head on a stem that are pink to purple in color. The bracts under the petal area have dark edge, giving them that part of the plant that has that spotted look. So spotted knapweed can create dense infestations, displacing native vegetation. It has deteriorated BC's interior grasslands, forests, and rangelands, and it's unpalatable to livestock. And it can also cause skin irritation to people. So if you haven't seen this plant before, and now you go out and drive the highways and look in pastures this summer, I guarantee you will see it. There are several bioagents that have been released on infestations of spotted knapweed. And what biocontrol is an invasive plant management technique involving their natural enemies. Well, it's a big process, but the insects, the natural enemies, are brought to BC, they're propagated, and then we can collect and release them to predate on the invasive plant. So there are several biocontrols available for spotted knapweed. Well, to approve the species to come in and to see the impacts on the plants once the insects are released. So there are root feeding weevils and seed head flies and weevils as well that can be applied to spotted knapweed.
Thanks, Coleen. And we wanted to make sure that we did mention a few invasive insects. They can definitely have impacts to properties and humans. And these are species that we're trying to prevent from coming into our region and establishing. So the European fire ant is an invasive red ant originally from Europe and Asia, found in BC in the year 2000. And this red ant not only bites, but has a venomous sting. So they have underground nests with no visible mound. They have distinguishing anatomy, but often look very similar to native red ants in BC. There are known infestations in the Lower Mainland and one place in the interior near Naramata. And like I mentioned before, the queens do not fly. So the only way they can be transported is if they hitchhike in a plant pot or in soil. So if you purchase plants or soil from outside the region or from anywhere else, you should tap the pot or the bag and see if ants respond to the disturbance by swarming. So they'll usually try to find a way out. Just as an example of how it affects property values and properties is in Deep Cove, North Vancouver, there were landowners that paved over their backyards because they couldn't use them anymore. When a homeowner says, I can't let my dog out or I can't walk on my grass because of ants, they swarm and they will sting and bite. And what happens in Deep Cove is the European fire ant infestations were so extensive that humans and pets couldn't walk anymore without being bit and stung. The other insect that we wanted to mention was brown marmorated stink bug. So, and this is an invasive stink bug, and we have a lot of stink bugs in BC, just to be clear. And the way that you tell this one is that you can see in the picture there are bands of white lill on the antenna. So, and I'm not an expert in entomology or in bugs, but we have both Coleen and I have colleagues and people that we reach out to get positive identifications using photographs and actual species. You can throw it in a container and put it in the freezer, and that will humanely freeze the bug, and then we can use that sample to positively or negatively identify. So originally from Asia, it was first detected, the brown marmorated stink bug, in 2015 in BC. So it's in the Fraser Valley in Vancouver and the Okanagan. And in both the adult and the young stages, this insect feeds on fruits and vegetables. They damage them by puncturing the flesh with their mouth parts. So it results in bruising and dead areas on the fruit and plants. They feed on over 100 different plants. And in the mid-US states, it caused a loss of $37 million to the apple industry alone. They also swarm houses in urban areas, and people find that very disturbing and awful. So they're finding overwintering spots.
So do you want homeowners to treat those? Like, we get that in Lillooet quite a bit.
Well, this stink bug hasn't been identified in Lillooet yet.
It's the maple ones that I'm thinking about.
Yeah, there definitely are. This would cover, if you look on the internet, you can see pictures of this bug, covering the whole side of a wall of a house, basically.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, you would definitely want to connect with a professional that deals with extermination and things like that. So it doesn't cause necessarily any damage to a house, but it's a nuisance. It's if you're going to have fruit trees or anything like that, that's going to be where you want to make sure you get rid of it.
If you're the host home, that's the overwintering location for these bugs, and your neighbor has an orchard, then you're going to have an issue. And so exterminating would be probably the kind thing to do before you're sued for loss of fruit from your next door neighbor. Okay, got it.
Good. Very good point. Very good point. And the other thing that we wanted to bring up was aquatic invasives. So my organization does do outreach and education, and we do some sampling with the zebra and quagga mussels. And Coleen's program mainly targets the invasive plants that live around water as well. So if you're selling a lakeside property or even places with artificial ponds, it's really important to mention these few aquatic invasives. And there are other plants that ponds tend to, that people like to put in and that are invasive. Yellow flag iris is one of them. It's a common garden iris that likes wet environments, but it can be dry as well. So it can be found in ditch lines. It's been used for pond features, grows up to 1.5 meters tall, and it was introduced into North America in the late 1800s as a garden ornamental. It grows in a variety of environments, but prefers the wet ditches, wetlands, lake shores, and ponds. It spreads by roots and large seed pods. The pods can float in water for up to 3 months. And in Lillooet, there are 2 lakes that have infestations of yellow flag iris that we've been removing for 5 years. The thick tubers and rhizomes create a dense mat that displace native species next to lakes and streams. And it can also clog water intakes. So there's a property just outside of Lillooet that has yellow flag iris next to the irrigation pond, and it clogs the water intake of that irrigation line every year. So the property owner has to remove the iris so he can ensure that his fields and irrigation water, they have the water it needs. The other thing we wanted to mention that thankfully zebra and quagga mussels are not in BC. They are freshwater invasive mussels that were introduced into Canada and the Great Lakes in the ballast water of large shipping ships. They are the only freshwater mussels that can cling to hard surfaces, and they were produced very fast and cover docks, rocks, boat props, and many other surfaces. They originate from the Black, Caspian, and Azov seas, and they're not currently in BC. So the provincial government has inspection stations that are part of the BC Mussel Defense Program. And these mussels, if introduced, would have devastating effects to our environment and the economy. The sharp shells, they wash up after the mussels die. The shells wash up on beaches, making it a hazard for walking. And the mussels can clog pipes like this one shown in the photograph. So in the Elris region, hydro facilities contribute up to 6% of BC's total energy. And if mussels were to infest these facilities, they would require removal, and the cost of treatment would likely increase our cost of hydropower. So both these mussels, zebra mussels, cause 300 to 500 million annually to damages to power plants, water systems, industrial water intakes in the Great Lakes region. And they're expected to cause $64 million annually in damages should they or quagga mussels spread to the Columbia River Basin. And I met a woman that was visiting our winery last year, and she said one of her summer jobs in Ontario in the Great Lakes was as a lifeguard. She actually had to rake up these shells from the beach so that people wouldn't get their feet cut.
Okay, so we're nearing the end here, and we just wanted to touch base a little bit more on available resources. So in the event that you didn't know, each region of the province has a regional invasive species organization that folks can reach out to for invasive species support. So within the TNRD and SLRD, the regional committees are ELRIS and the TNIPMC. And then we also have the Sea to Sky Invasive Species Committee as well that kind of shares the SLRD with Jacquie. So a large part of our role is to provide education and outreach to groups like yourselves, assist with training on invasive species, and offer technical advice, including treatment recommendations and sharing resources. So if you have any further needs or questions or can think of areas of collaboration, Jacquie and I are happy to work with you. And I can see, as you mentioned, Casie, the benefits of maybe having tailored resources to specific regions might be a handy thing for realtors to have to hand out to their clients.
Yeah, definitely. When we distribute the media, I'll be sure to create maybe a Google Drive file of some of the resources that you have to offer and a link to the course that realtors can take to help identify some of the invasive species plants that we should be more aware of. And again, we are always allowed to provide feedback to our different associations. Our forms seem to change quite commonly. So there are different property disclosure statements, whether it's a residential, rural, or land only sale. But again, they seem to address mostly the known environmental hazards when it comes to, say, oil tanks, or if that owner is aware of any material latent defects. And like you said, so all these new owners that have come up over the last 3 years from the Lower Mainland to buy rural properties, they might have been there for 3 or 4 years and still don't realize the severity of the infestation that they have on their land, and it's just going to keep passing over to the next person. So again, the more resources and education we have to provide, and the more awareness we have as we're going through paperwork with our clients, probably in the long run, it's going to be very helpful and protect us too. Because like you said, if there's a bylaw infraction or something put on where remediation is necessary to get rid of those weeds, maybe the property owner is going to get sued, but that probably means a realtor is going to get sued at some point in time because we didn't bring forward the issue, or maybe suggest a proper inspection be done. So again, disclosure, basically. So I'm happy to provide those resources as part of the media package that we put out afterwards. And I certainly appreciate all the information you shared today. We've got a few people still on. If anybody has questions, feel free to unmute yourself and ask. Otherwise, I will send you a copy of the recording and the resources that Jacquie and Coleen are offering us as well. I don't think we have any questions, so I think we're all good. Thank you both very much. I really appreciate all the time, and I look forward to gathering the material and distributing it for you.
Great. Well, thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Casie.
Yeah, have a nice afternoon.
Yep. Take care.
Bye-bye.